Marcus Johnson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stepped off the city bus. The autumn air felt crisp against his skin, but his hands were shaking slightly. Today was the day he had been preparing for months. At 17 years old, Marcus was about to give the most important speech of his young life at the downtown community center. The building stood before him like a fortress. Its brick walls had witnessed countless community meetings, protests, and celebrations over the past 50 years. Today, it would host the annual Youth Leadership Conference, where young people from across the city would share their stories and ideas for positive change. Marcus clutched the folded papers in his jacket pocket. His speech was about growing up in the east side of the city, where poverty and violence had shaped his childhood in ways most people couldn't imagine. He wanted to talk about hope, about how education had saved him, and about the programs that needed funding to help other kids like him. As he walked toward the entrance, Marcus noticed the crowd gathering outside. There were teenagers like himself, but also adults, city officials, and what looked like local news crews setting up their equipment. The sight made his stomach flip with nervous energy. "You ready for this, Marcus?" asked Sarah Chun, his debate team partner who had arrived earlier to help with setup. She was holding a clipboard and wearing the volunteer badge that identified her as one of the event organizers. "I think so," Marcus replied, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "There are more people here than I expected." Sarah smiled encouragingly. "That's good. It means people want to hear what you have to say. Remember, you earned your spot here. The selection committee chose your essay out of hundreds of submissions." Marcus nodded, remembering the day he had received the acceptance letter. His grandmother had cried tears of joy when he read it to her. She had raised him since he was 8 years old, after his mother's addiction had made it impossible for her to care for him. His grandmother, Rosa Johnson, had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and had always insisted that education was his ticket to a better life. "I need to check the microphone one more time," Marcus said, heading toward the main auditorium. Inside, the community center buzzed with activity. Volunteers were setting up chairs in neat rows, while others arranged pamphlets and water bottles on tables near the entrance. The stage at the front of the room looked smaller than Marcus remembered from his practice session the week before, but somehow more intimidating now that it was surrounded by professional lighting equipment. Dr. Patricia Williams, the conference coordinator and a professor at the local university, approached Marcus with a warm smile. She was a tall woman with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she had a reputation for mentoring young leaders in the community. "Marcus, I'm so glad you're here early," she said. "I wanted to go over the schedule with you one more time. You'll be the 3rd speaker, right after the opening remarks, and Maria Santos from the West Side Youth Center." Marcus listened carefully as Dr. Williams explained the timing and logistics. He would have 15 minutes to present his speech, followed by a 5-minute question and answer session with the audience. The whole event was being recorded for the local cable access channel, and several newspaper reporters were planning to attend. "Don't let the media presence make you nervous," Dr. Williams advised. "Just speak from your heart like you did in your essay. That's why we selected you." As people began filtering into the auditorium, Marcus found a quiet corner backstage to review his notes one final time. His speech was titled "Beyond the Statistics," and it told the story of how his neighborhood was often reduced to crime numbers and poverty rates in news reports, while the real stories of resilience and community strength went untold. He thought about his friend James, who had been shot 6 months earlier while walking home from basketball practice. James had survived, but the bullet had damaged his spine, ending his dreams of a college basketball scholarship. Instead of becoming bitter, James had started a peer counseling program at their high school, helping other students deal with trauma and violence. Marcus also thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran a small grocery store on his block and always let families buy food on credit when times were tough. She had been robbed twice in the past year, but she refused to close the store because she knew how important it was for the neighborhood to have a place to buy fresh food. These were the stories Marcus wanted to tell. He wanted to show the audience that his community was more than just a collection of problems to be solved. It was a place where people looked out for each other, where young people had dreams and worked hard to achieve them, despite the obstacles they faced. 5 minutes until we start, called one of the volunteers. Marcus took a deep breath and walked to the side of the stage where he could see the audience gathering. The auditorium was filling up quickly. He spotted his grandmother in the third row, wearing her best dress and holding the small purse she only used for special occasions. Next to her sat Mr. Thompson, his English teacher, who had helped him revise his speech multiple times over the past month. As Marcus scanned the crowd, he noticed a man in an expensive suit sitting in the back row. The man looked out of place among the casually dressed community members and young people. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and a stern expression. Something about his posture and the way he was looking around the room made Marcus feel uneasy, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Dr. Williams took the stage to begin the opening remarks, and Marcus tried to push his nervousness aside. This was his moment to make a difference, to speak up for his community and his generation. He had worked too hard and come too far to let anxiety get the better of him now. Dr. Williams finished her opening remarks to warm applause, and Maria Santos took the stage. Marcus watched from the wings as Maria delivered a powerful speech about starting a community garden program that had transformed an empty lot into a source of fresh food and pride for her neighborhood. Her words were confident and inspiring, and the audience responded with enthusiasm. As Maria concluded her presentation and answered questions from the audience, Marcus felt his heart rate increasing. He was next. He pulled his speech from his pocket and unfolded it carefully, even though he had memorized every word. The paper gave him something to hold onto, a physical anchor for his swirling thoughts. And now, Dr. Williams announced as she returned to the podium, "I'd like to introduce Marcus Johnson, a senior at Roosevelt High School." Marcus's essay about growing up in our city's east side was selected from over 300 submissions. His perspective on youth leadership and community resilience impressed our entire selection committee. Please join me in welcoming Marcus to the stage. The applause felt warm and encouraging as Marcus walked to the podium. The stage lights were brighter than he had expected, making it difficult to see individual faces in the audience clearly. He adjusted the microphone and placed his speech on the small stand in front of him. "Good afternoon, everyone," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "My name is Marcus Johnson, and I want to tell you about a place that most of you have probably only heard about in news reports about crime or poverty statistics. I want to tell you about my neighborhood and about the people who live there who don't usually get to tell their own stories." Marcus found his rhythm as he spoke about growing up in public housing, about his grandmother's sacrifices, and about the teachers and community members who had believed in him when it would have been easier to give up. He talked about the challenges his neighborhood faced, but he focused more on the strength and resilience he saw every day. "When people talk about my community," Marcus continued, "they usually talk about what we don't have. We don't have enough good jobs. We don't have enough safe places for kids to play. We don't have enough resources in our schools. And while those things are true, they're not the whole story. What we do have is each other. What we do have is hope. What we do have is young people who are determined to break cycles and create better futures." The audience was engaged, leaning forward in their seats. Marcus could see his grandmother beaming with pride, and several other audience members nodding in agreement with his words. He was beginning to feel more confident, more connected to the message he was trying to convey. That's when the man in the expensive suit stood up. At first, Marcus thought the man might be leaving early, which would have been disappointing, but not unusual. Instead, the man raised his hand as if he had a question, even though the question and answer period wasn't scheduled to begin for several more minutes. Marcus paused, unsure of what protocol to follow. Dr. Williams stepped forward slightly, but before she could intervene, the man spoke loudly enough for his voice to carry throughout the auditorium. "Excuse me, son," the man called out, his tone dripping with condescension. "I think there's something you need to understand before you continue with this little speech of yours." A murmur rippled through the audience. This was clearly not part of the planned program, and People were confused by the interruption. Marcus felt his face flush, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Sir, if you have a question, I'll be happy to address it during the Q and a session in just a few minutes," Marcus replied, attempting to keep his voice steady. The man ignored this suggestion and continued speaking, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "You need to understand that you're not special. None of you are special. This whole conference, these speeches about youth leadership and community resilience, it's all just feel-good nonsense that doesn't change anything." The auditorium fell silent. Even the volunteers who had been quietly moving around the room stopped what they were doing. Marcus felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. This was not what he had prepared for. No one had told him what to do if someone in the audience attacked, not just his speech, but the entire premise of the conference. The man continued his tirade, seeming to gain momentum from the shock he had created. "I've been listening to kids like you give speeches like this for 20 years, and nothing ever changes. Your neighborhood is still poor. Your schools still don't work. Your crime rates are still too high. You want to know why? Because you're not special enough to change anything. None of you are." Dr. Williams stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to either take your seat quietly or leave the premises. This is a conference for and about young leaders, and your interruption is inappropriate." But the man wasn't finished. He pointed directly at Marcus, who was still standing at the podium, frozen by the unexpected attack. "Look at him," the man said. 17 years old. Thinks he's going to change the world with a speech. "Kid, let me save you some time and disappointment. The world doesn't care about your story. The world doesn't care about your neighborhood. You're just another statistic, and all the hope and determination in the world won't change that fact." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. These were the words his worst inner critic whispered to him in his darkest moments. They were the doubts he had fought against every time he stayed up late studying instead of hanging out with friends. They were the fears he had pushed down every time he dared to dream about college or a career that could lift him out of poverty. But as Marcus looked out at the audience, he saw something that surprised him. Instead of nodding in agreement with the man's harsh words, people were looking uncomfortable, even angry. His grandmother had stood up, her hands clenched at her sides. Mr. Thompson was shaking his head in disgust. Even some of the other young people in the audience looked like they wanted to say something in response. The man seemed to interpret the silence as validation of his point. "You see," he said, spreading his hands as if he had just proven a mathematical theorem. "No one can argue with the truth. You're not special, kid. None of you are special enough to matter." That's when Marcus realized something important. This man, whoever he was, wasn't just attacking him personally. He was attacking everyone in that room who believed that young people could make a difference. He was attacking the idea that communities could heal themselves, that education and determination could overcome systemic problems, that hope was anything more than naive delusion. Marcus looked down at his speech, then back up at the man who was still standing in the back of the auditorium with a satisfied smirk on his face. He made a decision that would change everything. Marcus folded his prepared speech and put it back in his pocket. The words he had memorized suddenly felt inadequate for this moment. Instead, he gripped the sides of the podium and looked directly at the man who had just tried to destroy not only his confidence, but the hopes of everyone in the room. "You're right about one thing, sir," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent auditorium. "I'm not special in the way you mean it. I wasn't born with advantages. I didn't grow up in a house with 2 parents and a college fund. I've never owned new clothes or taken a vacation or even eaten at a restaurant that wasn't McDonald's." The man's smirk widened, as if he thought Marcus was agreeing with his assessment. But Marcus wasn't finished. "But you're wrong about what makes someone special," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "You think being special means being born lucky. You think it means having things handed to you. You think it means never struggling or never failing or never having to work twice as hard as everyone else just to get half as far." Marcus could feel the energy in the room shifting. People were sitting up straighter, leaning forward to hear what he would say next. His grandmother had tears in her eyes, but she was smiling now, and Mr. Thompson was nodding encouragingly. "I am special," Marcus declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "Not because I'm better than anyone else, but because I refuse to let people like you convince me that I don't matter. I'm special because when my friend James got shot, instead of giving up on our neighborhood, I worked harder to become someone who could help make it safer. I'm special because when my mother couldn't take care of me, I didn't use that as an excuse to stop caring about my education." The man in the expensive suit looked less confident now. A few people in the audience had turned to stare at him with obvious disapproval, and he seemed to sense that his intimidation tactic wasn't working the way he had planned. Marcus pressed on, his words flowing from a place deeper than his prepared speech. "Every person in this room is special, sir. Not because we think we're perfect or because we think changing the world is easy. We're special because we're here. We're special because we believe that our voices matter, that our experiences have value, that our communities deserve better than people like you writing them off as lost causes." Dr. Williams had moved closer to the podium, ready to support Marcus if needed, but she could see that he had found his footing. This was no longer a 17-year-old boy being bullied by an adult. This was a young leader defending not just himself, but everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. "You want to know what I've learned growing up where I did?" Marcus asked, looking directly at his heckler. "I've learned that the people who try to convince you that you don't matter are usually the people who are most afraid of what happens when you realize that you do." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Several young people were nodding vigorously, and Marcus could see that his words were resonating not just with his peers, but with the adults in the room who remembered what it felt like to be underestimated. "I've learned," Marcus continued, "that when someone tells you that you're just a statistic, what they're really telling you is that they don't want you to prove them wrong. When someone tells you that nothing you do will ever matter, what they're really telling you is that they're terrified it might." The man in the suit was no longer smirking. His face had turned red, and Marcus could see that he was clenching and unclenching his fists. But instead of responding with more verbal attacks, he seemed to realize that he had lost control of the situation he had tried to create. "You don't know anything about the real world, kid," the man said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "You're living in a fantasy if you think speeches and good intentions are going to fix anything." Marcus took a deep breath before responding. "Maybe you're right that speeches don't fix everything. But you know what? I'm not just giving speeches. I tutor kids at the community center every Tuesday and Thursday. I volunteer at the food bank every Saturday morning. I'm part of a group that's working with city council to get better lighting installed in our neighborhood parks." As Marcus listed his activities, he could see other young people in the audience nodding. They were doing similar work in their own communities, making small, but meaningful contributions that people like the angry man never saw or acknowledged. "So when you tell me that nothing I do matters," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear, "you're not just insulting me. You're insulting Mrs. Parker, the 8-year-old girl I helped learn to read last month. You're insulting the families who got fresh groceries because I helped sort donations at the food bank. You're insulting every kid who feels a little bit safer walking home at night because we fought for better streetlights." The auditorium had become completely silent except for Marcus's voice. Even the volunteers had stopped moving around, captivated by the unexpected drama unfolding on stage. "I may not be special in your world, sir," Marcus concluded, looking directly at the man who had tried to humiliate him. "But in my world, in my community, among the people I love and serve and learn from every day, I matter. We all matter. And no amount of cynicism from people who have given up on believing in change is going to convince us otherwise." The silence that followed felt different from the shocked quiet that had greeted the man's initial outburst. This silence was charged with emotion, thick with the collective realization that they had just witnessed something remarkable. A teenager had not only stood up to an adult bully, but had articulated something important about dignity, purpose, and the power of believing in yourself even when others don't believe in you. Then, from the third row, Marcus heard the sound of clapping. His grandmother was on her feet, applauding with tears streaming down her cheeks. Within seconds, Mr. Thompson joined her, then Sarah Chun, then Dr. Williams. The applause spread through the auditorium like wildfire, growing louder and more sustained with each passing moment. But something else was happening too, something that would turn this moment from a personal victory into something much larger and more significant. As the applause continued to build, the man in the expensive suit began moving toward the exit. But he wasn't walking alone. Something extraordinary was happening in the auditorium, something that no one, including Marcus, had expected. People were standing up and moving into the aisles, but they weren't leaving. Instead, they were positioning themselves between the hostile man and the stage where Marcus still stood. It started with just a few people near the back of the room, but the movement spread quickly. Maria Santos, the young woman who had spoken before Marcus, stood up from her seat in the front row and walked to the center aisle. She turned to face the man, not with anger, but with quiet determination. Within moments, she was joined by other conference participants, both young and old. Dr. Williams noticed what was happening and made a quick decision. Instead of trying to restore order, she stepped back and allowed the organic response to unfold. This was something she had never seen in her 20 years of organizing community events, and she sensed it was important to let it happen naturally. The man seemed to realize that his path to the exit was becoming blocked, not by force or aggression, but by a wall of people who had simply decided to stand together. Their message was clear without anyone having to say a word. Marcus had their support, and the man's attempt to intimidate and demoralize had failed completely. "This is ridiculous," the man muttered, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "It's just a bunch of kids playing at being important." But his words no longer carried the sting they had before. If anything, they seemed to strengthen the resolve of the people who had risen to form this protective barrier. More audience members joined the group, standing in the aisles, creating an even more visible demonstration of solidarity. Marcus watched this unfold from the stage in amazement. He had expected that his response to the heckler might inspire some supportive applause, but he had never imagined that his words would spark this kind of collective action. People who had never met before were standing shoulder to shoulder, united by their shared belief that young voices mattered and that cynicism should not go unchallenged. Among those who had stood up was a woman Marcus recognized as City Councilwoman Janet Rivers, who represented the district where the community center was located. She was known for her advocacy on education and youth programs, and her presence in the protective formation sent a powerful message about official support for the conference and its participants. Next to her stood Robert Kim, a local business owner who employed several young people from various neighborhoods around the city. His participation showed that the community's response crossed generational and economic lines. This wasn't just young people defending themselves. It was an entire cross-section of the community saying that attacking hopeful young voices was unacceptable. The man tried a different approach, raising his voice to address the crowd that was blocking his path. "You people are making fools of yourselves over a kid giving a speech. This isn't going to change anything real." This time, it was Maria Santos who responded. "Sir, you're wrong about something important. This already has changed something real. It's changed how we see ourselves and each other. It's changed how we respond when someone tries to tear down instead of build up." Her words were calm, but firm, and they seemed to speak for the entire group. The man looked around at the faces surrounding him, searching for some sign of doubt or wavering support, but he found none. If anything, the longer he stayed and continued his negative commentary, the more unified the crowd became. Marcus realized that this moment was about more than just defending him from one person's harsh words. The community that had formed spontaneously in that auditorium was demonstrating something powerful about collective action and mutual support. They were showing that when someone attacks the hope and dignity of one person, they attack the hope and dignity of everyone who shares those values. "I think it's time for you to leave," said Mr. Thompson, Marcus's English teacher, speaking directly to the disruptive man. "You've made your point, and we've made ours. This is a space for building people up, not tearing them down." The man looked like he wanted to argue further, but He seemed to finally realize that he was vastly outnumbered by people who were not going to be intimidated or convinced by his negativity. The expressions on the faces around him ranged from stern disapproval to quiet determination, but none showed any sign of backing down. "Fine," the man said, pushing past a few people who stepped aside to let him through, while still maintaining their protective formation around Marcus. "Waste your time with these fantasy solutions. See how far speeches and good intentions get you in the real world." As he moved toward the exit, the man continued muttering complaints, but his words seemed hollow now, powerless against the demonstration of community solidarity he was witnessing. The contrast was stark, his voice alone and bitter against the quiet strength of dozens of people who had chosen to stand together. Dr. Williams stepped forward as the man finally reached the door. "Sir," she called out, her voice professional but firm, "for future reference, this community center welcomes respectful dialogue and constructive criticism. What you engage in today was neither respectful nor constructive. Our young people deserve better, and our community expects better." The man paused at the exit, perhaps considering one final retort, but the sight of the unified crowd seemed to drain any remaining fight from him. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a decisive click. As soon as he was gone, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The protective formation began to dissolve, but instead of simply returning to their seats, people started moving toward the stage. They wanted to talk to Marcus, to congratulate him, to tell him how proud they were of the way he had handled the confrontation. But more than that, they wanted to be part of whatever energy had just been created in that room. The man's attack had backfired completely, galvanizing the community in a way that Marcus's original speech, powerful as it was, might never have achieved on its own. The aftermath of the confrontation transformed what was supposed to be a routine question and answer session into something much more meaningful. Instead of the polite, predictable questions that typically followed youth conference presentations, the audience was energized and engaged in a way that surprised everyone, including the organizers. Marcus found himself at the center of a conversation that went far beyond his original speech about community resilience. People want to talk about how to respond to negativity and discouragement, about the importance of supporting young leaders, and about the power of collective action when faced with attempts to undermine hope and progress. "Marcus," said Councilwoman Rivers, who had approached the stage along with several other community members, "what you did up there was remarkable. But I want you to know that what happened in this room today was about more than one person standing up to a bully. This community just demonstrated something very powerful about our values and our commitment to our young people." Dr. Williams nodded in agreement. "In all my years of organizing conferences and community events, I've never seen anything quite like what happened here today. When that man tried to tear you down, this entire room stood up to say that wasn't acceptable. That's not something you can plan or organize. That's something that comes from the heart of a community that believes in itself." As people shared their thoughts and reactions, Marcus began to understand that the incident had revealed something important about the strength of the community he had been speaking about. His speech had talked about resilience and mutual support in abstract terms, but the audience's response to the hostile interruption had demonstrated those qualities in real time. James Martinez, a college student who had been sitting near the middle of the auditorium, raised his hand to speak. "I want to thank Marcus for showing us how to respond to people who try to discourage us from believing in ourselves and our communities. But I also want to thank everyone who stood up today. You showed me that when someone attacks one of us, they attack all of us." This sentiment seemed to resonate throughout the room. Marcus could see people nodding and murmuring in agreement. The man's attempt to isolate and demoralize him had instead created a powerful sense of unity and shared purpose among everyone who had witnessed it. Sarah Chun, who had helped organize the conference, approached the microphone. "I think what we've experienced today shows us something important about the difference between criticism and cruelty. Constructive criticism helps us grow and improve. What that man did was different. He was trying to destroy hope and confidence, not build anything better. Her observations sparked a broader discussion about how to distinguish between helpful feedback and destructive attacks, a skill that many young people struggle to develop. Marcus found himself fielding questions about how he had managed to stay calm and focused during the confrontation, and how he had found the courage to respond so effectively. Honestly, Marcus admitted, I didn't feel brave in that moment. I felt scared and angry and confused. But then I looked out at all of you, and I remembered why I wrote my speech in the first place. I remembered all the people in my life who had believed in me when it would have been easier to give up. I realized that if I let his words stop me, I would be letting down everyone who had invested in me and supported me. His grandmother, Rosa Johnson, had remained in her seat throughout most of the post-presentation discussion, but now she stood up to speak. I want to say something to all the young people in this room. She began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through many challenges and learned from them all. That man who tried to discourage my grandson today, he reminded me of people I've known my whole life. People who gave up on their own dreams and then try to convince everyone else to give up too. But you know what? Every generation has people like that. And every generation also has young people like Marcus who refuse to listen to them. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of teenagers and young adults who were hanging on her words. The most important thing you can do when someone tells you that you don't matter is to prove them wrong by mattering more. Not by being perfect, not by never failing, but by caring about your community and working to make it better one day at a time. The wisdom in her words seemed to settle over the room like a warm blanket. Marcus felt a surge of pride and gratitude as he watched his grandmother command the attention and respect of the entire audience. She had been his biggest supporter and his most consistent source of encouragement, and now she was sharing that encouragement with everyone present. As the formal Q&A period came to an end, something unexpected happened. Instead of dispersing to their cars and buses, people lingered in the auditorium. Small groups formed organically, with young people and adults continuing conversations about community engagement, mutual support, and the importance of believing in positive change. Marcus found himself surrounded by peers who wanted to share their own stories and experiences. Many of them had faced similar moments of discouragement and doubt, and they were energized by his example of standing firm in the face of criticism. You know what the best part of today was? Asked Maria Santos, the young woman who had spoken before Marcus. It wasn't just that you stood up for yourself. It was that all of these people stood up with you. That man thought he could come in here and make us all feel small and powerless, but instead he reminded us of how strong we are when we support each other. Dr. Williams approached Marcus as the crowd began to thin out. Marcus, I want you to know that we're going to be sharing video of today's events with other youth conferences around the state. Not just your speech, but what happened during and after the interruption. I think other young leaders need to see how a community can respond when someone tries to undermine their hope and confidence. The idea that his experience might help other young people in similar situations filled Marcus with a sense of purpose he hadn't expected. What had started as a personal challenge had become a teaching moment that might inspire and strengthen youth leaders far beyond his own community. As Marcus finally prepared to leave the community center, he realized that the day had given him something more valuable than the speaking opportunity he had originally been excited about. It had given him proof that his belief in community resilience wasn't just wishful thinking. He had witnessed it firsthand, had been protected and supported by it, and had seen how quickly a group of strangers could become a unified force for good when the situation called for it. The man who had yelled, "You're not special," had been wrong about everything. Marcus was special, not because he was perfect or because he had been born with advantages, but because he was part of a community that believed in lifting each other up rather than tearing each other down. And as he walked out of the building with his grandmother's arm linked through his, Marcus understood that being special had never been about standing alone. It had always been about standing together.